Summer 909. It was the evening, and Osrith's usually high-energied younger brother sagged. He knew it was over, if the Norsemen's defeat by the Scots was correct. They had been garrisoned in the villages surrounding Bibbenberg as Uthod's attack came, and had been defeated. It meant her elder brother's deeply held aim to recapture Bibbenberg was one step nearer. They had also inhabited Lindisfarne, under Sainid's leadership, in an attempt to make an agreement on behalf of the King of Alba with the King of the West Saxons. "I will go, Wigger," Osrith said. "Constantine knows I'm here." "He knows you're here," Wigger repeated, grimly, "which is why he has requisitioned most of the food for his army. We will starve eventually, as Edward tried to starve Sigtryggr Eoferwic." Osrith took a step towards him. All summer, Uthod had been attacking the beach, until suddenly he was called away. She had discovered that Eoferwic was under attack. Sigtryggr had called on his father-in-law from attack from the West Saxons, Edward and his army. It had given Wigger time to refortify, and he had paid Inner and his Norsemen to build a palisade around Bibbenberg. Now it would go unfinished, or at least, unfinished enough to be useless. For Uthod had returned and was camped beyond the fortress, and it would not take him time to launch his attack, having sailed from Cookham up the east coast masquerading as a pelt trader to fool Wigger's men, to fool Sainid's men before it was too late to stop them. Constantine gave him nothing. Osrith went on. Merely restated his desire that the land to the was Pitland, Alba, that is and was his to own, to claim. Wigger gave her a long look. "And when it is yours, you will give it to him." "A Saxon fortress to a gale." Osrith said nothing. His optimism had lessened as the season had gone on, as the lean month of July before the harvest had hardened his will. His men were loyal still, but it was clear that they craved their life overseas, Viking as the Danes Vikinged, and it was merely that he wished to hold on to a base in Northumbria that kept him going. "Wigger, I have no desire for this place. It is yours," she sighed. "And Bibbenberg is certainly not, and will never be Constantine's." He held out his hands and crossed to Osrith, standing at the place Osrith had as her very first memory of her home, near her uncle's chair, with Bicca standing beside her, and her mother, her aunt, smiling weakly at the joy of her marriage. Bicca had been directed to take her to the chapel to teach her to read, and Osrith remembered looking above her uncle, to the banners of Bernicia, the red and yellow blocks alternating across the cloth, and being entranced by the colors. She took them. "We can fight him. We will fight him. Constantine will honor the treaty you made with him, that is certain." "Certain, certain, because of Edra," Osrith thought. Certain because she was, still, his spy, though the only spy in the world who paid for the privilege of espionage, rather than the other way round. "Because I have Constantine macked since he was 11 and defended him against the Norsemen, Ivar the Boneless. You know of him, do you not?" Wigger's winning smile returned. "His kin flood Northumbria, claiming Cumbraland, claiming Eoferwic." Wigger looked angry. No, Osrith thought, he looked resigned, as if it were just a matter of time that he would lose Bibbenberg. But then, like the Northumbrian weather, clouds parted and he smiled, warming her face, reminding Osrith how much of a delight her younger brother was. It was how she had long imagined Uthod would be, in her immature mind, an image which had long been Osrith's undoing. "Our mother loved you," Osrith said, warmly, "when you were born." "Mother ... my aunt ... lived nearly a month, fed you herself, would not let you out of her sight." "But then Bicca, the priest?" She nodded. "He told me she was taken by God as she slept. She felt no pain. He wanted me to know. But I felt a coldness then, in my inside. I wanted to fight against everything. I felt Elfric spelt on my legs many times for being unladylike. And you escaped." He pulled Osrith to his shoulder and gave her a sisterly hug. "I survived. I've never stopped. All I've done since then was to find ways of getting along. And on the way I've done so many things. I can't sit around in Bibbenberg, managing the estates. I need to be away, doing." Wigger said nothing for a while, as he held her close, and Osrith thought how alike they were, in that he needed to be away winning treasure and men and loyalty. What was Bibbenberg to either of them, really? "Will you remarry?" she said, after a time, how this place would thrive with the laughter of children. Wigger loosened his hold and Osrith stood away from her brother. Another image had replaced the derelict one of Utad inhabiting Bibbenberg, one of her alliance to Wigger as he re-established the Idings at Bibbenberg, with herself as aunt to a gaggle of nieces and nephews as they brought life to the home of their ancestors. But she knew her little brother was set on leaving. While he toyed the idea that she could manage Bibbenberg for him frivolously between them, Osrith suspected that once he had defeated Utad, that would be what he wanted to do. And to spite her elder brother, Osrith was very happy to support her younger one. I may not. His non-committal reply was enough. Then I will do all that you wish me to do, Wigger, she replied. Deep down, Osrith knew that Utad desired to win the fortress of their ancestors far more than she wanted to defend it. But, she could defend, and knew she could precisely because it was her elder, treacherous brother, who had sold her out to Ethelwold, who had thwarted her at every step, who had divided her from Finan, who bidded for it. If you wish to leave me with men who are loyal to you, I will happily manage your restate. Truly, in the glimmering light of setting sun, she saw her brother's eyes glow, and she watched as her words fitted into spaces in his head which he had forged. It was what Wigger wanted to hear. You would truly do that, for me? Osrith smiled, more assured of this course of her life than she had been about anything she had done in her life so far, and nodded. His face, crinkling around the eyes, told Osrith she had been right, and that this felt right. How much Wigger looked like their mother then, at that moment, an embodied male version of Jaitha of Cumbraland, dark brown hair of the Britons, of the line of Arian, honourable to his Cumbric ancestors as well as his Anglish blood. A true man to lead Northumbria, Oswald reborn. Which it is why it was heartbreaking that her baby brother had no desire to contemplate another marriage and more descendants. Come, sit beside me, Osrith, Wigger asked. And they sat adjacent one another on a wooden settle near the hall's great throne. Utad is at Frisia, is he not? That is what the rumours say, Osrith replied, looking at the lazy waves bringing in a spring tide and which would, in 6 hours' time bring in another, with Sainid. So they will be false. Osrith bent her face to her younger brother, nodding at his astonished eyes. And I have what he desires, most of all, she added, or rather, Sainid does. Your betrothed? Osrith nodded. I asked Constantine what it would take for me to leave me alone and he told me my marriage. Wigger looked at her in astonishment. So, the only man I would ever consider the head guard of the Scots army? He rescued me from the Norse when I was 12, as I had rescued Constantine. He was beside me when I wielded Fada sword on the battlefield, patched me up, treated me as an equal. Constantine has given us land to farm. Where? Wigger frowned, his eyebrows curling towards one another as he listened to his sister. Beric. Claiming Lothian as Pictish, so therefore Scottish. Expecting Wigger to be angry, Osrith braced herself. But her brother did not shout at her. Instead, he shook his head, and smiled. Clever, he mused, shaking his head. Very clever. Land which he would claim, land which I would claim, land which the sea might claim. Wigger reached for her hand, and held it, affectionately. And you love him? Sainid? The Scots name sounded strange when Wigger said it. Aye, she replied, thinking in Gaelish. His name was of that king, Sainid Mac Alpin, Constantine's grandfather. He is loyal and faithful, and has been for many years. He is probably in sight of your land there. Wigger pointed to Lindisfarne. And where does it say otherwise that Constantine owns it? Where does it say I do? It says so here. Osrith got to her feet. She had wanted to save the surprise until tomorrow, but now was a perfect time. In the light of the dying sun, she crossed the throne room to a curtain, behind which was a door. Wigger must have known all about it because his face betrayed no surprise. But, it altered in a flash when Osrith went through it, and pushed open an upper door, which opened above Wigger's chair. It was just big enough for Osrith to climb through even as an adult. and she threw down the bundle from this secret hiding place. It has taken her a lot of silver and a lot of guile to get them. Anything else you have up there? Wigger called as she tossed the bundle down to him into his hands. Like 100 weight of gold. I think you'll find this is worth more than gold, Osrith called, and Wigger unrolled a fine linen standard upon which a black wolf's head was embroidered. Beneath it, parchment, and on it, the declaration of inheritance of Bibbenberg, taken by Bucku and kept safe by him, until the day he died, passed on to Hild, who has passed them on to Ethelfled. It had taken surprisingly little inducement for them to get into Osrith's position. What did my cousin, your brother, do to you? Wigger asked, shaking his head, knowing that his possession of these meant he, as the next Christian male of the line Ethelfrith, was the legal possessor of the place that had been the dream of Uhtred to the core. His driving force. Osrith skimmed her memory for frivolous conversation. He gave Ingolfrid to Osferth, she began. Alfred's bastard son. They live in Mercia now, near Momcoster. And your own son was a member of the West Saxon army, last I heard. If he is not dead, he will have just invaded Eothwick with King Edward. Deprived me of a nephew and sister-in-law. She jumped from the upper door and landed heavily beside her brother, who was goggling at the documents. Though I cared for her, Ingolfrid was not one of my father's best decisions. She was the daughter of a Norse lord, Ivar's kin, he added, glancing away from the flickering flames of the peat fire to Osrith. It broke my father's heart, his kin taken from him. I think it was then I knew, after all of his harshness, all of his cruelty, what was I actually for. The wheel in a cog to get from him to my own children, no matter the way. A political match. Wigger shook his head, sadly. As would have happened to you, has Elfric given you over to Cjutun? Dunham was no place for a child. It's barely a place for human. Even now. He put his arm around Osrith's shoulders. And yet Thyra survived. Barely. You did right by her daughter. Wigger's humanity radiated from his beaming face, and he put his arm around Osrith's shoulders. And you have not told me why you hate Uhtred so much. It is good that you think so, my little brother. I pay enough for her keep with Constantine. Osrith looked up to him. You want to know? Wigger nodded. And she told him everything. From the time she had left Bibbenberg as a 12-year-old, through to her time at Dunotter, Caeliquilid. She told him about Finolien Tagden Domnall, and her escape south to Winchester because of King Domnall's betrayal. All of that did not involve Uhtred, but what came next did, and Osrith did not hold back. Once she had finished, Wigger leaned back in the settle, looking away from her for a moment, and then his blue-green eyes met hers. Yes, he said eventually. Yes, I do see. I understand, Osrith. He had never once said she needed him to be with a man, or a husband to rule Bibbenberg. The only person ever to assume that she was capable of managing his interests in Northumbria while he was away. That was how she knew that Wigger was the right choice. When he turned his gaze to her from the sea view, Wigger took up her hands. For you, after what you have done for me, and all you have said you will do, I will take his life. My cousin. Wigger growled the last words, like a dog aggressively attacking a tough bone. And, for once, Osrith did not argue. Wigger would kill him. He had the desire and the will, for if he did not kill Uhtred, Uhtred would kill him. And, inside the fortress named for the Pictish princess married to the Anglish warlord, Osrith and Wigger sat in the very center of Bibber's fort and planned for war. 88,888,888. That's Uhtred. Gah, Wigger's sea captain, once a warrior from a land beyond Francia, looked through his dark, heavy brow across the chasm between the inner perimeter wall of Bibbenberg and the men marching towards the beach. Never had Osrith seen such loyalty from men to a lord. Wigger had saved many of their lives and led them all to riches and glory across and beyond the Mediterranean Sea. This land was too cold for many of them, and more than once Osrith had seen the men rubbing one another's limbs. It was summer, so it was hot enough for Northumbria. Osrith had remembered colder summers, and this year's harvest was going to be bountiful. But Wigger had promised them that, once they had defeated his cousin, they would be sailing south, then west, to the lands they loved best. It is, Osrith agreed, standing beside him, Buate a hand. He will attempt to use the sea gate, and slip inside. She pointed to the man-made harbor below them, no longer a little inlet from which she had sailed Sobra's hid boat, but enlarged to accommodate Wigger's ship. He will also try to attack over the cliffs at your weakest point. Gar turned, looking across the land. He beckoned a few men over to him, signaling with his finger where these were 2-3 of the other men. Then, he pointed down. The gates. Osrith nodded. She understood him to mean these were a weak point. 2. The conduit, where the servants throw the slop for the pigs. Behind then, Wigger narrowed his eyes. He did it at Dunham. He has the while. I am glad to find you, sister. He patted her arm. And, now for your birthday surprise. Osrith turned to him, astonished. But, it is not my birthday, I don't think, she protested. But Wigger pointed beyond Bibbenberg. Dark blue sails, richly declaring they belonged to Constantine. There would be a battle there, on the sands. That would determine much. And what it determined would determine who would make an attempt on the fortress itself. Osrith had promised not to fight. It had been a hard promise to make, but she understood Wigger's thinking. If one of them died, then the other could live. And Osrith could not bring herself to contemplate telling Wigger he should be the one to go. Men stepped out of the boats now. Looking carefully, Osrith could see a man she deeply cared for arranging his troops. She could stand beside Senid, make Utad see that she cared both for Aldo as well as Bibbenberg. You know the general? Her brother asked. Osrith smiled. Senid, she smiled. His crew have made good practice at landing here over the years. Then Wigger leaned close to her ear. The man you love, he concluded. Osrith stared at her brother, then nodded. It was a false gesture. She knew she could grow to love Senid in a way, and be settled with him, at Berwick. But the man she loved would be at Utad's right side, plotting how to breach Bibbenberg's defenses with him. Be safe, Osrith. Whatever happens. Kissing her brother, Osrith made her way to the lower story of the fortress and down Oswald's steps. It took her minutes to be at one of the cave entrances, as the Scottish army made its way across Bibbenberg's pale yellow sand. She looked at her hands, into which he had thrust something, and smiled. The Bibbenberg documents and Utad's standard. No time to think, for there she was, within spitting distance of Constantine's general. Senid strode with his men across the beach, making it look as if the Scots prepared to attack Bibbenberg in response to Constantine's recent assertions at land ownership. Gain Bibbenberg, gain the prize in the north, and his dream was all but realized. Utad knew this too, but could not be entirely sure, especially when Wigger's men began to shoot the Picts, who made up the bulk of Senid's army. 1 or 2 had seen Osrith now, and were making to pursue her, swords raised. But Senid called them back, driving them to run forwards, not left, towards the cliffs. Whether Osrith did catch his eye, she never could tell, but she remembered him striding out towards the fortress, screaming the Gaelish yell that they all had learned. For the Picts were forgetting their Pictishness and were Gaelifying themselves according to Constantine's rights and honours. No dual kingdom status on the east coast of Alba. The Picts and Gaels thought as Scots and were now fighting as Scots, giving no quarter to the men of her younger brother, matching them stroke for stroke. She ran. Beyond the fortress a gully ran which, if she took it, carried on up towards an unnamed settlement by a little stream. Wigger had given money for a white horse to be kept there so that she could ride north when the time came. This time came. Osrith. She turned, her right foot on the cliff rock, not expecting to remove it and turn, as she did. Finan the Mighty stood before her. Osrith bore down onto the rocky path and began to climb. Don't go, please. But Osrith did. Not up the gully to her mare, but through it, and down into a small cove. Behind her, Osrith heard quickened footsteps. When they were well concealed from the battle behind them, Osrith turned to her once lover. When she could go no further, Osrith turned, and prepared to stare him down, and was taken aback at his appearance. Older, yes, much older than she remembered. Finan's hair was greying at the temples, though his hair was still waist-length, bound with a leather strap. His eyes were the same pale blue-grey like Constantine's. He was breathing heavily, and also fighting to control his breath. Osrith's rapid pulse slowed as she screwed up her left hand, and made a fist around Bue's hilt. He had every right to be angry with her, for leaving Winchester nearly 10 years before, without a word. Did he hate her so much, then? Was he for murdering her right then and there? The remembering of his hands upon her body made Osrith shiver, and she moved towards the gap in the rock, where the hot summer sun dived through, illuminating the yellow-white sand in the cave, throwing her bundle at the foot of an ancient stone which was also lit by the summer sun. "You left," Finan said, eventually. Osrith nodded. "Yes." "With a child?" "Yes." "To Alba?" "To Alba," she agreed, standing as still as she could. And she would be away to Alba now, except that... It was Finan. She waited for him to say something, but it was tears not words which left him, flowing down his cheeks. Finan ran to her and, before Osrith could even attempt to stop him, he took her into his arms, holding her tightly to him. "God in heaven, Osrith, I have missed ye so much." And then he kissed her, mouth pressing so hard to hers that Osrith wondered whether they were bruised, tears reaching her mouth and onto her own face. She didn't care. She loved Finan of Ireland, and would give anything for him to be by her side until the end of time. He tangled his fingers into her hair, and Osrith held onto him tightly until her muscles ached. When he had finally finished kissing, her face, her neck, her hair, he drew her to him, Osrith's head against Finan's shoulder. "I too, Finan Moore," she whispered, which only began him kissing her again. But then she broke away, treading the soft sand to the wide sun-gapped fissure. Finan made to follow, but Osrith held up a hand of warning. "Please come no further." The look on his face was heartbreaking, and Osrith felt a lurch of pity in her stomach. "What is this place?" he asked. When King Oswy turned to the Roman Church, there still were adherents to the Irish Church, Osrith began. She pushed a pile of sand away from a stone block which was lit up by the shard of summer sunlight. They kept in secret, they corresponded with Kells, Doia, Armaka. Osrith looked through the gap. "But that was nearly 200 years ago, and it is no longer used. I used to come in here when I was a child, for peace." "I can see why." Finan nodded. "I am here with Utad." "I know." "And you are here." "You are for your brother." "Then, I am." She stared determinedly at the face she had seen in her dreams for so long. "Then God's love upon," but Osrith rushed to him, and placed a finger to his mouth. "Not that brother. He is treating with Constantine for access to the lands, in exchange for support here. The Scots are to have Bibbenberg." "With Wigger?" Finan sounded aghast. But, of course, he had been beside Utad for so many years that to think another way was clearly too hard for him. "Why not?" Osrith deliberately misled. "I am for independence of the North from West Saxon ambitions, not unity." "Edward invaded Eothwic, did he not?" "With the Scots." Finan shook his head in disbelief. "With a people who are more like the Bernicians, and Durians too, than the West Saxons. We are Angles and we are Brittonic. I have more in common with Wigger than I ever could with Untard." Finan looked shocked. "But, Osrith shook her head, moving away from Finan again. "Wigger has never wronged me." "But Utad." But Osrith turned, and when she spoke, the bitterness and regret of the years flew from her and into the air between them. "I travelled to find Utad," she declared, at last. "He turned out to be a dissolute, cowardly, ungodly, arrogant man who would stop at nothing for his own way, for that fortress, and forced me to leave." "Please." Finan stared at her. "Please?" he asked, confused. "Please don't give me the line about him being a slave, or Elfric being his enemy. All three of us have reason to have despised Elfric." "Yes, but," Finan looked pleading. "And you took his wife and child back to Wessex, Finan?" "Yes, but..." "And she is now Osferth's wife." "Yes." "But Osrith," he shouted, throwing his hands towards her in frustration. "What?" But his tone was meek now, full of the same hurt that had filled him when he followed her. "When you left." He looked away, and spoke to the altar. "It hurt me, a lot, when you left." It was like Ethan dying all over again. He looked at her, eyes wide. "Worse, I tell ye," he sighed. "Worse than her death!" I. Osrith stepped towards him and she made to take his hands, before stopping. I am sorry. You know what I did to myself, for my own mistake. And then, what he did to me. She turned to look at the pool of light by her feet. Uttered. What did he do? Finan demanded. But Osrith didn't answer his question. Instead, she continued. Then, it became harder to return. I had a baby to support, because Anthera's child. What? They were defeated. It was clear what he had thought, and Osrith waited a while, as the battle sounds permeated the little church. Then, she looked at him. You fight for my enemy of a brother, Finan. I am spy for the king of Alba. How can we be together? A little shard of her self-respect crystallized in satisfaction at the surprised look on his face. I don't know, Finan replied, his shoulders sagging. But I do know this is nothing. He waved his hand towards the fortress, because of how I feel about you, Osrith. Still. It was her turn to be shocked. Finan nodded, then paused. Osrith said nothing. Instead, she turned away from him, and began to look out towards the sea. And how do you feel? His urgent question was pitiful, but still Osrith did not reply. God damn it, Bin Mokri, Finan shouted. Have you no heart? It was then that Osrith turned her eyes on his face. Then, within a moment, she ran to him, into his arms. I love you, Finan more, she cried, her words absorbed by his leather jerkin. I have loved you, kiss, since I first knew you. The sand was damp. Finan took off his cloak. They kissed and they continued to kiss, hands on each other's body, hers on his leg, his up her shirt. A kiss turned into much more. Even after all the years that had passed, memory of touch and caress and love were remembered, and their bodies fervently remembered for them. Bereft of clothing, Finan lay her down, gently, and knelt astride her, kissing and kissing as if there was not enough time left in the world. And after Osrith remembered the waves crashing against the cliff. They were safe there. No high tide could reach the little church. How was it that the air was so sweet now, the waves feeling like a thick blanket embracing them both? How could it be such a marvelous moment? And yet, Osrith told herself, she was shivering. But still she shuddered in Finan's arms. You don't like the water, number. That is understandable. After Finan broke off, Osrith turned her naked body to look at his face. After what? You're nearly drowning. Osrith frowned. Who told you that? Finan shifted under her, his cock resting by her leg. I was there, Osrith, when you rescued the little shit Edward from the river. But something in her sensed that what Finan told her was not the truth. I must go, he said, suddenly. Utad will have got to the beach. Osrith moved, and he got up. But, before he could dress, she flung herself on him again, nestling her head to his chest. Will I see you again? Across the sand, I expect. But Osrith shook her head. He held her away from him suddenly, and looked into her eyes. You will not join Utad? I will not. Then, he kissed her again, and she felt his hardness grow once more, and it was all Osrith could do not to instigate her passion again. Be safe, Osrith, Finan said at last, after he had dressed, and he pulled her to him for a kiss. I will turn from you if I face ye, he added. And I, too, Finan ma tilde squared. Osrith watched him leave, then made her way up the gully, to the settlement, to her white horse, making sure she did not cast eyes upon the battle on the beach below her. 88,888,888. She had been born in the autumn months of the 66th year of the 8th century after Jesus Christ was born. Osrith knew. She knew that because Father Bacot had showed her a large Bible where, at the back, was written the names of her family, her ancestors, back to Ecgfrith, Oswy, Oswald, Ethelfrith, all the way back to Ida, and then back to Noah, the father of all since Adam. She had a 9-year-old foster daughter residing in the care of King Constantine of Alba, for whose upkeep she paid, and she spied for the Scottish king, or at least, paid some of Edra's keep with her intelligence. Though, not with her body. Not now. Since she had left Constantine to visit Guthard, Osrith had made a promise to herself that neither the King of Scotland nor the King of the West Saxons would touch her again. She had moved on. That she was riding inexpertly. Osrith had never got the hang of horses. Towards Lothian, once Bernician lands, was merely a detail. Osrith would be free of them all, including her brother. That meant Twigger would have to win. She would know, Osrith told herself, when a message came from Bibbenberg. One way or the other, one of her brothers would be lord of her former home and she would return, either in triumph or in war. She had enough money now to not be reliant on either of them, and enough strength still to fight in battle. Yet, her heart knew what the outcome would be, and even if she were to shout it from Bibbenberg's high cliffs, saving many hundreds of men's lives, it would do no good. Utad's will to own the fortress which had been all their homes once, far exceeded the will of Wigger to prevent him. Osrith knew she would just have to be patient, something she was never very good at. On collecting the horse from Bibbenberg's tenants, she rode the handsome white mare following the coast. The yells and screams of battle rose from the strand line. Do not look, Osrith told herself. Do not look, or you will abandon your beautiful mount and join them. So she thought of Edra, her willful daughter, who could speak 5 languages and whose firm friend was Constantine's second son, Uldub, who was as dark as his father and astute as his mother. He would marry her, should his father consent. Mary had given Constantine many children, but only 2 boys. And Constantine had been careful enough since with Selarch, having had to hand him over as hostage to Utad many years before,